Okay, thank you so much, everyone. My name is Elise LeCompte. I'm the Registrar and Assistant Department Chair at the Florida Museum of Natural History. I'm also the museum's Health and Safety Coordinator. And part of that job is to oversee all aspects of health and safety for the collections and the staff. This includes the development of the museum's emergency preparedness plan, the annual updating the plan, writing protocols and procedures, and planning and coordinating our emergency response procedures. Okay, I'm going to show Ann how to advance my slides. See the all right. According to the Getty's publication, Building an Emergency Plan, a threat is defined as an indication of imminent danger. That is such a short, innocuous definition for an event that has the potential to be so catastrophic if we have not planned properly for its possibility. To know what to plan for, an important first step in the process is to have a good idea of what dangers threaten us. Threats come from many different sources and in many levels of severity. Some are a result of nature's wrath, but as you can see from this slide, most are man-made. Most of the sources of natural threat are well known, and by using our common sense, we can figure out what the results of such a disaster might be at our own institutions. For example, a hurricane will probably bring some level of wind, water, and structural damage. By examining your facilities carefully, you can easily figure out what might happen to your institution. For example, the walls of your structure may be able to withstand the onslaught of wind and water during a hurricane, but what about your roof? What about the building penetrations like windows and doors? What about the loading dock door? Some of the man-made sources of disaster are well known and unfortunately may be fairly common to some of us. A busted pipe, a mold outbreak, a pest infestation, a leaky roof or window, or inadequate wiring. Other threats may never occur to us until we are actually in the throes of an emergency created by one of these threats. For instance, an insect sting causes someone to go into anaphylactic shock. A caterer's hot plate starts a fire. An educational demonstration using an open flame or hazardous chemicals goes awry. Some human threats, like active shooters, have only recently invaded the hallowed halls of museums and cultural institutions. Witness the shooting at the Holocaust Museum in 2009. In terms of severity, what might be a minor incident that would have involved only a small part of the facility can quickly become a catastrophic event, leading to the total destruction of an institution without proper emergency planning. This slide reiterates some of the potential threats, both natural and human, both big and small, that we might have to deal with at some point in our professional careers. Things such as forest or brush fires, hail, combustible decorations used for an event, educational demonstrations, or sewage backup. While many disasters remain out of our control, the ability to prepare and respond to them properly and effectively is within our control. I was surprised to find out that fire is the #1 threat to cultural institutions. It does the most damage, both in terms of the amount lost and the cost. It does more damage than any other threat, natural or man-made. The next several slides show some examples of damage. This slide shows some of the flood damage that the Randall Research Center headquarters, a Pine Island satellite facility at the Florida Museum of Natural History, suffered as a result of Hurricane Charlotte. This is a prep lab at the facility that used to be a garage. A thick, hardened sludge covered the floor and bottom inches of the walls, and the furniture and equipment that were in the lab. Artifact bags stored on the bottom shelves of the racks and cabinets were inundated with water. This slide shows roof and chimney damage, as well as structural damage to the headquarters building. Biological damage can take several forms, including mold and insect damage. The left is covered with mold, and the mask on the right, the nose is caved in. The interior wood of the mask nose was eaten away by bugs. Pressure placed on the nose when the mask was picked up broke through the remaining thin outer crust. There are three separate components in assessing potential danger to an institution. Hazard, that is the probability that a disaster will occur. Vulnerability, that is the degree of exposure to a hazard and the amount of loss from a disaster. And risk, that is the probable loss from a disaster as determined by considering the hazards of a location and the vulnerability of the assets located there. Assessing potential disaster risk requires an analysis of the hazards and vulnerability, determination of acceptable levels of risk, followed by the development of reasonable preventive measures. Risk assessment relies on a hazards and vulnerability analysis. It determines acceptable levels of risk and thereby provides a basis for making decisions about which preventative measures are needed. The hazard assessment determines the kinds of threats to which an institution is exposed and the likelihood of their occurring. Vulnerability analysis assesses the kind and extent of damage that a given hazard might do. We may be able to do very little to change our exposure to hazards, but we can certainly do a great deal to reduce our vulnerability. An institutional risk assessment involves a complete examination of an institution's facilities, inside and out, top to bottom, door to door, as well as a critical evaluation of the institution's policies and practices. Some aspects of risk assessment are common sense. For example, most of us are capable of spotting fire hazards like frayed wires, too many extension cords, and a lack of enough fire extinguishers. Most of us can identify leaks from worn-out roofs, poorly sealed windows, and rusty pipes. In some cases, however, it is a good idea to call in experts to help with the risk assessment. People like your own facilities managers or maintenance crew, or those from your parent institution, a police officer to examine security and policies for dealing with violent behavior, a representative from the local fire station crew, a representative from the utility company, a structural engineer, your local state fire marshal, someone from the city, county, or state emergency management agencies, colleagues who have been through actual emergencies. The larger the disaster, the further afield you will have to go to procure resources to deal with it. Minor to moderately sized events that affect only a portion of the institution can be handled with in-house resources, provided that the necessary resources, things like supplies, designated labor, and funds, have been identified, stocked, and set aside. Moderate to larger sized events that impact the entire institution require that resources be garnered from the community, the region, or even the state. Community-wide or regional disasters require that resources be procured from the state, region, or even at the national level. It is essential that you identify the source and location of required resources for all of the different types of disasters that you might face well ahead of the time. That is to say, when you develop and update your emergency preparedness plans. If you do not do this, the resources will not be. Many of us have heard horror stories from the institutions that did not plan ahead well for the hurricanes. The power was out for months, so there was no HVAC system, and no generators were available. If generators were available, gas hadn't been stocked in enough quantity. There was not enough lumber and tarps to cover gaping holes, thereby compromising the institution's security. There was not enough food and drinking water to keep cleanup crews going, and not enough dry towels, plastic bags, and boxes to protect water-soaked objects until they could be transported to conservators. You cannot always prevent a disaster, but you can drastically reduce its effect on human life and property. Protective measures are steps taken to eliminate hazards or to reduce the effect of threats. Protection is a long process and one that never ends. Those of us involved in planning must constantly remind our colleagues that protection is a #1 priority. Planning for protection helps reduce the institution's vulnerability and increases its ability to lessen the effects of threat and to recover quickly from any disasters. During the planning process, short and long-term priorities for protective actions should be set, and budgetary resources should be targeted. It is easier to request funding for specific projects than for the amorphous goal of quote-unquote emergency preparedness. In conclusion, threats to our facilities, our collections, and our visitors and staff are all around us every day, day in and day out. However, with good emergency preparedness planning, we can face them with confidence and come out of a disaster relatively unscathed.
Thanks so much, Elise. That was an amazingly choked presentation with just a huge amount of information. And let me ask those of us around in the 4 different cities who's got questions and what those questions might be. I'm going to put Larry on the speaker, Larry Kilmer from Lowry Park Zoo, who has a comment. Go ahead, Larry. You can be picked up from there.
Okay. I think there's a tendency if you have an old plan or no plan to be overwhelmed in this process. And my advice would be to just take it in steps. Go ahead and produce a plan. You can always come back to it in 6 months and add to it. But I think it gets overwhelming initially because we all want to solve everything right now. We want everything to be protected. But rather than not have a plan or get bogged down in process, take it in small chunks, because it can be, extremely overwhelming if you've never done one or yet when it's very outdated.
So just to make sure everybody heard, Larry Kilmer's comment from Lowry Park Zoo is better to have something down on paper to have started than to be overwhelmed and just sit and do nothing. So a start puts you much further along than anything else. We've got a comment from Kathy Slusser here in Sarasota, and I'm going to let Kathy take it over.
I was just thinking about the supplies needed. One of the problems that it seems like at Pine Island after the hurricane was not enough supplies with the towels and the bags and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's hard to find a place to store all of that, especially at the small museum like Pine Island. I wondered if anybody had any ideas about not just buying all of that and keeping it, but a place to store it.
Elise, did you hear that question about Pine Island that you might want to respond to?
Yes, I did, Miriam. Oh, sorry, I keep having to move away from the microphone to work the computer. I did hear the question, and it was, what do we do with the supplies? And to form a regional group, work with someone who maybe has more space and you can buy supplies together. It has to be somebody fairly close, but you could form a little regional group, a little community group where you could share supplies, and that also helps with funding as well.
Thanks for that response, Elise. And I see that Bert has a question from Tallahassee, or the folks in Tallahassee, so I'm turning the mic over to Bert.
Okay, thanks, Miriam. Actually, I wanted to pass along a little bit of additional information. This is from Eric Robinson, who's the archivist at the Supreme Court Archives. And he wanted to mention that the State Archives has a really great disaster recovery link which includes vendors as well as advice. But unfortunately, it's kind of buried within the State Archives website. We probably can get more information out on this, and it needs to become more visible. So we're just wondered whether everyone might be aware of this resource.
Bert, this is Miriam, and I'm going to say that I saw about 8 pens get picked up as you started talking in Sarasota. So what we can do, and Eric, thank you so much for suggesting that resource. What we can do is add that web link so that people can easily find it to the online community that we're creating.
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent idea, Miriam. One of the reasons just that it was created, so I'll be glad to put that up just as soon as possible.
I've got another comment or question here in Sarasota, so I'm going to turn the mic over to Vinnie Luisi from Dunedin.
Elise, I had a question, actually twofold question. You mentioned it in the amount. How did you start preparing a budget, and did you increase your budget as you find more and more things are necessary?
That's a really good question, and unfortunately, it will vary from institution to institution and the resources that are available to that institution. I have a very supporting director, and so we don't often get everything we ask for, but we also have, of course, the university resources. So, for instance, we have a generator provided by the university. One thing that I think you can do in that instance is, again, form community groups to help with your budgetary needs. Buy things in bulk, or get with the city or the county to help you get a generator. And of course, budgets will increase or decrease from year to year. I think that it's a good thing to evaluate your resources, your financial resources, and realize that emergency preparedness is extremely important. If you don't have what you need and can't recover from an emergency, then what's the point of your existence to begin with? So there's a lot of talking and discussion with governmental groups and with your board and with your directors to really make them understand how important this is and how important it is for you to get the budgetary resources. That's not a really super answer, but those are my thoughts on it.
Vinny's got a follow-up question.
Elise, your presentation was very good, and I guess, and we're all sitting here writing and jotting down things. Is the presentation going to be available where instead of just writing everything, we can pull it out on the web somewhere?
I'm going to go ahead and answer, not to put you on the spot, Elise, because you don't have all the details of the behind-the-scenes stuff. But the answer is yes. These webinars will be available in the online community. They're being recorded live, and you will have access to the content of the PowerPoint presentations online in the online community as well. So yes, for those of you who are feeling like you missed an important note and you wish we'd put the slide back up for a few minutes, you'll have access to it. I see that the group in Tallahassee has another question, so I'm turning the mic over to them.
Okay, thanks, Miriam. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention there that should be hopefully showing up in the chat box, and again, we can put it in the community forum. Thanks to Bill Modrow here, we've gotten the URL for the State Archives website on disaster recovery. If you can catch that, and we'll also put it up in the community board. And then we had two other comments here, one from our facilitator, Linda Deaton, and that is it's very handy if you need to store your supplies, just use some plastic trash cans. And those are things that can be emptied out real easily, and when you have to replenish the supply. And one other comment from Lynn Roberson at University of West Florida. When you're gathering up supplies, you don't really need to buy everything at once. Just maybe buy like a little bit periodically. And sometimes it's a good idea, as she's found, to put out a wish list for your membership to donate, or your group, your audience. So hopefully everyone caught that, but we can still put it on the community forum.
Those are two great suggestions. Thanks so much to the folks in Tallahassee. Let me circle around to the folks in Miami and see if anybody has questions or comments there.
No, I think we're pretty good down here.
Okay, and those of you sitting with Elise, I know you are looking at each other and asking questions amongst each other. So if somebody has an important other comment, I'm going to turn my mic off for just a second to let you hop on. Otherwise, I'm going to move us to the next part of our discussion.
This is Elise. I have a quick comment about the supplies too. It's really important after you go through a disaster to inventory your supplies. And actually, we inventory ours annually when we update our plan, because things disappear. They're not supposed to, but people go into the boxes and take things, and so we do an annual inventory. And that's a good time to buy what's missing, or if you think of something else that you need. So again, like Lynn said, you don't have to buy everything at once.
Elise, that's an incredibly important comment and underscores the fact that there are all kinds of small emergencies that happen where you just need something really quickly and you know that it's in one of those garbage cans with big emergency supplies, so you just go get it. I think Larry in Sarasota has one more comment. Larry?
Yeah, in relation to supplies for a living collection, we are checking our supplies several months in advance of hurricane season, because everybody else will be rushing to the store in June to buy the very same products that you're looking for, and then you can't find them. So if you can stage your plan to where you're doing this, I know it sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many times in June everybody's looking for the same types of products that we are for our disaster preparedness kits, and they're not available.
And I'm going to repeat this incredibly important comment because I think the mic may not have carried to everybody, but that is that if you wait for the hurricane to be upon you to go buy your supplies, they're going to be much more expensive and you might not find them. So Larry is pointing out that for animal food, they check their supplies every few months to make sure that they are ready with enough on hand, that they're not rushing around at the last minute with everybody else trying to get those supplies. So thanks very much. I'm going to take, I think, one more comment here in Sarasota, because that's the advantage, I guess, of being in Sarasota, is that I actually see the hand waves. But those of you in the other cities, your host organization can also type in a quick, Miriam, slow down, we have one other question here, but I'm going to let Françoise Haack from the Ringling make a comment.
I was just going to say the importance of a network, maybe of supplies, would also be a good idea where larger institutions possibly could actually come hand over their supplies in an emergency because they're already there. So the network importance would be wonderful.
Françoise's comment about the importance of the network in sharing supplies, and that maybe not everybody has to have everything, and that larger institutions have access to things that smaller institutions might not have access to, is incredibly important.